5 years of unspoken words, buried resentments, and painful misunderstandings dissolved the very second the snowstorm shattered the mountain silence, forcing me to stare into the eyes of the one person I had vowed never to forgive. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a life-altering realization, a heavy, suffocating quiet where all your carefully constructed walls begin to crumble under the weight of an undeniable truth. If you believe in the quiet power of human kindness, the transformative strength of forgiveness, the beauty of unconditional hope, and the miracle of second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, share this story with someone who might be walking through their own dark valley, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing family. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind us all of the profound beauty hidden within our shared human experience, proving that even in our coldest moments, warmth is never truly out of reach. The winter afternoon was painted in harsh, blinding shades of white and slate gray as Julian, and I trudged through the knee-deep snow drift toward the remote high-country shelter. The air was crisp and bite-sized, freezing the moisture in our lungs with every ragged breath we took under the heavy weight of our packs. We had been hiking for hours along the treacherous ridge-lined trail, forced into an uneasy alliance by a sudden, violent turn in the mountain weather that made descending back to the valley impossible. 5 years prior, Julian had walked away from our joint architectural firm, taking with him a prized municipal contract, and as I believed at the time, my professional dignity and trust. We had once been closer than brothers, sharing meager meals in college, dreaming up ambitious designs on paper napkins, and promising that no matter how successful we became, our bond would remain unshakable. But ambition, mixed with bad advice and poor communication, had poisoned our friendship, leaving behind a bitter wasteland of legal notices, formal letters, and cold, silent malice. Seeing him standing at the trail balance point earlier that morning had been a shock to my system, but the rising storm left us no choice but to push toward the timber-lined cabin together. When we finally forced open the heavy oak door of the cabin, the pale afternoon sun was casting long, cold shadows across the rustic interior. The shelter was sparse, built decades ago for forest rangers stranded during sudden high-country blizzards. The room was dominated by a single, narrow wooden bed frame fitted with a thick mattress, nestled directly against the rustic stone hearth. In the far corner sat an old propane radiator, its metal body dusted with years of mountain grime. My hands were already numb, stiffened into clumsy claws by the plummeting daytime temperature that dropped further with every passing minute of the storm outside. Julian dropped his heavy frame onto a wooden bench near the door, his face pale and etched with exhaustion, his breath billowing in white clouds inside the freezing room. I immediately knelt by the propane heater, my trembling fingers fumbling with the ignition dial, praying for the comforting hiss of gas and the soft orange glow of a pilot light that would bring warmth back into our aching bones. A metallic click echoed through the quiet cabin, followed by a hollow, empty silence that made my heart drop into my stomach. I tried again, pressing the valve, turning the worn dial back and forth, but nothing happened. A quick check of the external fuel line confirmed my worst nightmare. The copper pipe had fractured under the weight of ice buildup outside, venting all the fuel into the frozen air long before we arrived. There was no wood left in the indoor woodbox, and the raging blizzard visible through the frosted windowpane made stepping outside to gather damp timber a dangerous, foolish errand. The daytime light was still bright, reflected fiercely off the rising snowbanks outside, exposing every detail of our bleak reality with unforgiving clarity. The temperature inside the uninsulated cabin was dropping precipitously, matching the sub-zero environment outside, and my light winter gear was entirely inadequate for an extended freeze. Panic began to coil tightly in my chest as I sat back on my heels, staring at the useless metal box that was supposed to keep us alive. I looked over at Julian, whose shivering had grown violent, his lips carrying a faint, alarming bluish tint under the pale light filtering through the window pane. The arrogance and resentment I had harbored toward him for half a decade suddenly felt absurdly light when weighed against the immediate, primal threat of freezing to death in an isolated cabin. Julian looked up from his folded hands, his brown eyes wide with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since we were penniless students trying to pass our final exams. He raised a hand that shook uncontrollably, pointing toward the single bed in the corner, covered by a single heavy wool blanket that had been left behind by previous travelers. "Don't make this weird, Lucas. Just get in." "I'm freezing," Julian whispered, his voice cracking from the bone-chilling cold and the heavy emotional weight hovering between us. There was no defiance in his tone, no trace of the ambitious rival who had supposedly betrayed me, only a raw, desperate human being reaching out for survival. In that single, unvarnished moment, all my intellectualized anger, my years of rehearsed grievances, and my righteous indignation shattered completely. I realized that my pride had been a shield I used to protect myself from the pain of losing a friend, but holding on to that shield now meant literal destruction. I stood up on legs that felt like lead, crossed the creaking floorboards, and pulled back the heavy blanket, inviting the cold reality of our shared humanity to replace the illusion of our separation. We lay side by side on the narrow mattress, wrapped together beneath the stiff wool blanket, our backs pressed against each other to conserve every fraction of body heat we possessed. The contrast was stark. Outside, the icy wind howled furiously through the pines under the bright, cold daylight, while inside, two estranged men shared a quiet space of absolute vulnerability. For the first hour, neither of us spoke, our breathing gradually synchronizing as the initial shock of the cold began to give way to a cautious, shared warmth. The physical closeness forced a mental closeness that neither of us could escape. There were no phones, no lawyers, no work distractions, and no physical distance to hide behind. Every rise and fall of Julian's shoulders against mine was a quiet reminder that, beneath all our grievances, we were made of the exact same fragile flesh and bone. As the afternoon light shifted, casting deep indigo shadows across the rough log walls, Julian broke the long silence with a voice so low it almost dissolved into the sound of the wind. He began to talk about that catastrophic year 5 years ago, not with excuses or defensiveness, but with a profound, quiet honesty that I had never given him the chance to offer. He explained how our firm had been on the brink of financial collapse, a reality he had tried to shoulder alone to spare me the stress, while my father was battling terminal illness. The contract he took wasn't an act of greed, but a desperate, flawed attempt to keep the business afloat under a different structure, a decision that had backfired catastrophically due to poor legal counsel and his own overwhelming panic. He admitted his cowardice in failing to explain it to me clearly back then, choosing to let me hate him rather than reveal how completely he had failed to save our dream. Hearing the truth bathed in the cold, clear light of that frozen afternoon was like having a heavy iron band unclasped from around my chest. I listened silently, feeling the tears warm against my cheeks before they turned cold in the cabin air, realizing how easily pride converts miscommunication into lifelong enmity. I shared my own truths, the crushing loneliness of building a career alone, the bitterness that had poisoned my subsequent relationships, and the painful realization that I had chosen my ego over seeking the truth from someone I loved like a brother. We lay there in the cold, trading confessions and releasing years of stored poison into the freezing air, replacing bitterness with an overwhelming sense of relief and shared sorrow. The cold room became a sanctuary, a place where our old, broken selves were allowed to freeze away, making room for something honest and restored to take root. By late afternoon, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, sunlit landscape blanketed in fresh, untouched snow that sparkled brilliantly under a clear blue sky. The air inside the cabin remained frigid, but beneath the thick wool blanket, the warmth we generated together had kept the bitter freeze at bay. We sat up slowly, looking at each other not as former business partners turned enemies, but as two survivors who had crossed a vast emotional wilderness to find their way back home. The broken heater remained useless in the corner, but it no longer mattered. The real freezing danger had never been the ambient temperature of the room, but the coldness we had harbored in our own hearts for so many years. We gathered our packs, stepped out into the crisp, sun-drenched snow, and began the trek down the mountain side by side, leaving the dark baggage of our past buried forever in the high country cabin. Life rarely offers us a second chance wrapped in a comfortable package. Often, it requires us to step through the uncomfortable, freeze-frame moments where our pride must be completely abandoned in favor of basic human connection. When we hold onto old grudges, we are simply agreeing to freeze in the dark, refusing the very warmth that could heal us if we were only willing to reach across the divide. Before you move on with your day, please leave a meaningful comment below sharing a moment when you had to let go of your pride to forgive someone, or tell us what this story of second chances meant to you today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey.